And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. I am super excited for today's guest. I've got Srini Rao, and many of you will recognize that name. He is the founder of The Unmistakable Creative, which is definitely one of my favorite podcasts. I am typically not likely, people ask me all the time, like what your favorite book is, but it's like asking what your favorite kid is, and given all my clients write multiple books, I typically don't like to answer that question, but this podcast is definitely one of my favorites. So Srini's been a very busy guy. He's the founder of The Unmistakable Creative, which he's been doing for a decade. So he is not new to this space. He's interviewed over 700 people. Oh, by the way, he's also authored 3 books, 2 with Penguin and 1 that was self-published. That was a Wall Street Journal bestseller. He's been in Forbes, he's been in the New York Times, and he's lowering his standards to be with us today. So welcome aboard, Srini. How are you?
Well, I'm good, and that's I hope I can do justice to that introduction. So it's interesting that I want to just I think it's a great place to actually tee up the conversation. You said I'm lowering my standards to be with you, so it's funny, right? I think that we have this what I call a status bias, and that is it's more an illusion than it is a bias because I am notorious for turning down really, really famous people as guests. Like I've turned down Pulitzer Prize winners. I have never said it publicly, but I've turned down Gary Vaynerchuk. And people are just like, what? And I'm like, look, I will never make a decision based on what somebody's status is. I'm far more interested in what their story is and who they are as a person. And so, but it is interesting, right? Like I think we all have this implicit bias of, the New York Times is a more worthwhile media appearance than Peter's podcast. But the funny thing is that for all I know, your entire audience could become subscribers to the podcast, to Unmistakable Creative. And in the New York Times, I'm a blip on the radar. So it actually might be more worthwhile for me to be with you. But that's interesting jumping off.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because this is a niche podcast, right? So I've never cared about the size of the audience. It's really the quality. And I would argue we probably have the highest per capita New York Times bestsellers listening of the tiny, tiny couple of thousand folks that download a month, because those are our peeps, right? That's what we do. So I want to start with, you've got a lot of the boxes that we can check, right? So you're a keynoter, multiple bestseller, speaker, et cetera. But I really want to go into the podcast piece here because you've been doing this for a long, long time. I've been at it for 2 years and I actually like it. And I think one of the reasons I personally like it is because I hate writing, because I'm lazy and it's easier for me to talk. But yours is a longer format. It's aligned to the brand. So tell me about some of the do's and don'ts that you've learned about when you launch a podcast, how to stay on, on brand, define your market, blah, blah, blah.
Sure. So you mentioned that you like it. That's 90% of it right there, right? I didn't start a podcast. I mean, keep in mind, like when we started in 2009, everybody basically was saying podcasts were dead. It was the medium that, basically was the digital graveyard of the internet. Like, we didn't have the iPhone had just come out. The iPad hadn't come out yet. There were some people who were bullish. They're like, oh, give it like several years and it'll catch up. But I never started it because I thought it was going to lead anywhere. I had the funny thing is, you mentioned that I write books. The reason it started was because I was in this online course, where there were 13, one of the lessons was to interview somebody, and the 13th guy I interviewed. So I didn't just interview one person. I did a weekly series called Interviews with Up and Coming Bloggers. And the 13th guy, basically, I remember I went to him to try to go do some joint venture with him. And he actually said, no, that's a terrible idea. Besides, he's like, you're not a very good writer, but you're an extraordinary interviewer. And so he said, I think you should just follow that and, spin it out into a separate site. And I think that part of it was that I genuinely just enjoyed the experience of doing it. I mean, I still do, it's one of the things where I think that, it's one of the, it's really funny because you've talked to me on the phone. I talk too much, which is ridiculous considering that I'm an interviewer, and, women who have set me up on dates who know from the podcast are expecting me to show up as like the host of the podcast. And they get irritated that I didn't listen as well as they hoped I would based on how good I'm doing it on the podcast. Because I'm extraordinary at it when I'm, podcasting.
When you're on,
like, I'm like, I got to figure out how to translate this to my dating life. I'd probably end up,
But that would be like going on a date with a dentist and checking out cavities, right? Like
it's a little weird, right? It's kind of like this balancing act. I mean, I have to work at it still. Like I try to be mindful of it. And, but the thing is, it's this thing where I just get lost in it. It's one of those things. So here's the thing. I told somebody once that I believe my superpower is that I can take anybody. I'm convinced of this now, and I can put them behind a microphone and I can make them sound interesting.
But I want to go with that. So there's lots of reasons people do podcasts. So
Yeah, most of
ours
them are
has evolved.
shit, by
So
the way. Most
what's
of them
that?
are most of them are the wrong reasons. Just so you know.
Right. So we started doing it. We were blogging for years, doing video for years, doing all this sort of stuff. And then, like Captain Obvious said to me, well, you're better at talking than you are at writing. Why don't you like try that? I'm like, okay. And to me, originally, it was like, all right, I always thought of it as an experiment. Like,
Yeah.
let's try this for some period of time. We have access to some interesting folks based on what we do that are far more interesting than me. So we'll ask, cash in some chips and get some folks. And it's probably good for the brand, right? That was sort of my working thesis. Well, it's evolved to the point where it's not just good for the brand, it's good for business, that people that I meet through the podcast become friends, become clients, become whatever. So it's become sort of this weird non-biz dev, biz dev thing that's actually a ton of fun. I mean, it's the same as I'm doing all day without a mic in front of me, just getting on the phone or Zoom or whatever and talking to interesting people and seeing if there's a there.
So, so let's go back to the do's and don'ts of this. Ryan Holiday wrote an article, I think sometime probably about a year ago, that said, don't start a podcast, so I think that like one thing that I want to talk about is the motivation behind this. So what happened was, I think that, come 2015, we went from sort of lingering in obscurity to sort of not just us, but sort of the entire podcast ecosystem to what the journalist Kevin Roos referred to as an age of podcasting. And now even more so than ever before, because we're all just sitting at our, houses quarantined, trying not to lose our minds. And the thing that happened as a byproduct of that, particularly in the online world, I think the internet marketing space in particular, which I often refer to as the internet marketing circle jerk, is, I mean, and and the thing is, this isn't isolated to podcasting, right? So like blogging became popular. Next thing you know, everybody has a blog about how to start a blog and how to make money from a blog. And
there's conferences on how to be a blogger. And
and so, you create this entire ecosystem, which is really more of an echo chamber than an ecosystem.
Exactly.
To call it an ecosystem actually is not accurate. So then the same thing started to happen with podcasting. Online marketers clued in that, wait a minute, there's a massive audience that I could tap into. And so what ended up happening as a byproduct of that, I remember I was interviewed for somebody who was creating a course for somebody about how to start a podcast. I'm like, wait a minute, you don't even have a podcast and you're creating a course about how to start one and you're interviewing people about this. I'm like, this is bullshit. Your authority is highly questionable.
But there's the same, in the book space, I could Google now and find 500, be a bestseller author by, Joe Lipschitz from Cleveland that's never read a book, let alone written or something. And it's like, why are people, there's more money in selling the picks than, to the gold diggers.
So exactly. It's the gold rush, right? So, and then, particularly in the online marketing space, what ended up happening was, a few big personalities got, on their microphones and then shouted from, their megaphones of social media of, hey, everybody should start a podcast. Now, that is the stupidest statement that has ever been made by an online marketer. And I'm sure if one of them is hearing this, they're probably going to hate my guts, but I'm willing to take that risk. That is the dumbest thing.
I would hope there's none of them hearing this, because that's not my audience.
Well, no, it is the stupidest thing that anybody could say, because that's like literally saying that, Nike now only makes size 10 shoes. We should all wear them. It's like, well, no, if your feet are not big, you're going to look like a clown if you do that. And so what ended up happening is that everybody, of course, jumped on the bandwagon. And this is where all these cognitive biases come in. Right? There's the authority bias. It's like, when some authority figure tells you that, oh, everybody should start a podcast. You go and look at this person's results. It's like, wow, they're making like $70,000 a month from their podcast. Of course, everybody should start a podcast.
Exactly.
Let's not forget that there's numerous, biases here. First off, you have imperfect information. Let's look at that. One, most of these people, what they have conveniently left out. I don't know how the hell everybody has overlooked this, and it really makes me angry, because it's one of those things where I'm like, okay. And I'm not saying this because I don't think everybody should start a podcast. There are people who've done wonderful work in the last few years that I think I'm really glad they did. There are other people who honestly, they leverage their platforms, but their podcasts aren't that good. They just happen to have big audiences. So the thing that, you have sort of a imperfect information problem, where the thing that most of these huge, people left out is, oh, by the way, I had 60,000 people on an email list I could tell about my podcast.
Exactly.
How is that? That's imperfect information, right? Then there's the private interest problem, which, the private interest terminology is not mine. It's Douglas Vigliotti's, who wrote the
Yep.
Knowledge Gap. So I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due.
Sure.
But that's the private interest problem. I mean, look, every one of us who creates content is driven by private interest to some degree. Like,
Yeah.
I'm here. My private interest in people listening to this is I want them to subscribe to Unmistakable Creative. Like, there is a private interest at work. But, when somebody who says everybody should start a podcast, is now selling a course, you're like, wait a minute, look, of course this person is going to say that. They stand to benefit from this tremendously. Not to pick on Gary, he's just one example of sort of, not this in particular, but somebody will go, Gary is one of many people, social media influencers, who have, large enough audiences and large enough bank accounts that they can go and make investments in things like Snapchat and Twitter and whatever it is, right?
Significant investments.
Yeah.
I mean, it's if you're Gary, when TikTok lit up, to go there and become a top 5 on TikTok didn't take much. For me to do that would be like climbing Mount Everest based on my followership.
Well, not even for going and becoming a top 5 on TikTok, but if you think about the fact that somebody says, okay, I'm now an investor in TikTok, or like, I don't know if he is or not, but
yeah,
like I said, it's just the example that comes to mind because I know he's invested in a lot of the platforms that we use regularly. And, the funny thing is, I was like, if I invested in Twitter, or if I were an investor in Zoom, I know this, like, because I had, I took, minor equity stakes in certain things, like, and of course I'm encouraging people to use those products. Why would I not encourage people to use those products? Because if I happen to have equity in those companies, that equity is going to be worth a hell of a lot more if the people in my audience all go and use that thing. That is a private interest problem. So that whole bias thing, bullshit aside, right? That's one huge problem with this that is completely overlooked. I think that, people don't take context into consideration. So that is one thing. I want to address that first. Now,
if you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts.
Let's talk about, sort of motivation, do's and don'ts. Now, online marketers saw podcasting as a channel for more business, the kinds of things. It's like, oh, more people will buy my courses, more people will do this. Now, one thing I want you to consider is this. If you go and look at the top 100 shows in iTunes, none of them come from people who are online marketers, with the exception of Tim Ferriss. And Tim Ferriss is not really an online marketer. And he happened to be at this party long before any of those people. They're all storytelling shows, the stuff that comes out of NPR. There's a reason for that.
Or Wonderly or any of those, right?
Yeah. Audio is an entertainment medium first and an education medium second. And the problem is that if you just take information and try to put it into a podcast, like, nobody wants to listen to 10 ways to grow your blog in a podcast. That's mind numbing. I can read that.
Yeah. That's a bad PowerPoint, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, maybe somebody can do that justice, but at the end of the day, really good podcasts, the ones that stand the test of time, tell great stories. Like, I mean, you listen on Unmistakable Creative,
Sure.
So you notice that if I have a guest, we almost never talk about their work to start the conversation. I mean, it's very rare that anything about how they became successful and tactical stuff comes up. I am very, very story driven. And that is why I will often it's like people are like, oh, I can show you how to grow a blog. I'm like, nobody in my audience cares about that. And neither do I. Because that's just not that interesting.
But where I want to go with you for a moment is there's a lot of paths that authors and thought leaders take. And one is we don't do anything with online marketers, right? So we're in the more boring, if you will, B2B world, where people, academics, consultants, whatever, are creating wonderful content that has a business application. So by its very nature, it's going to lean a little bit more dry. Doesn't mean you can't bring it to life with stories. It doesn't mean you can't bring it to life with data, right? You sort of have to. For many of my clients, traditionally, we've been doing this a long time, the book was sort of the centerpiece, or the keynote was the centerpiece. And what I'm looking at in your world, yes, you have the books as well, but I would say, and I could be wrong, more people know you from the podcast than the book. And even if you look at the data, and I just had somebody on recently that told me depressing facts that not only does the average business book sell less than 1,500 units, the average person doesn't make it past page 18. So that's depressing, right? But given people feel that they know you and your ability and your style, based on the podcast so that they feel comfortable booking you for keynotes. Remember when those were things, right? Or doing other things with you because they might have listened to you every day for 6 months at the gym in your ear, and they get a sense of, it's literally your voice and your style and the quirkiness and the good, the bad, the ugly. And there should be no surprise when they call you and say, Srini, I'd like you to do X, because they kind of get what you're about, right? Like a book is 2-dimensional. And I think this is a little bit more of a 3-dimensional medium. So what would you add to that?
I think that you brought up a really good point about, dimension when it comes to media, right? So you're right. A book is 2-dimensional. And, the example that I come back to, we had some very, very early conversations with a talent agent at CAA about Unmistakable Creative as a TV show. We just, I saw the Letterman show that he did on Netflix, and I was inspired, and I was like, well, what would prevent me from doing that? And I was with my now roommate, and he said, absolutely. I was like, I have access to interesting people in droves. I have an audience. I just need a venue. So, for my book launch, I think for Audience of One, we actually did a live taping of a show in New York. But, it's like, well, how would I even get this? So my, roommate said, go ask your audiences. There's got to be somebody who might be able to help you. The one person who responded to me was a talent agent at CAA who happened to be a fan of the podcast. I was like, okay, cool. So we got to talking, and, long story short, he just, he shopped it around. They were like, we want somebody who's already a star. We don't want to make one. So that aside, but part of what I thought was appealing about video as a format was that you could paint a multidimensional portrait of a person that you struggle to do via audio. So if you look at the Letterman show, I think the brilliance of what he did, particularly when you look at the interviews that he did with Malala and other people, was you got this perspective of this person that went beyond the person that was just sitting in the chair. He had these conversations with her family members, these beautiful shots of where she grew up and everywhere.
Right.
And I remember looking at that thinking, wow, if I could take somebody like my friend Mars Dorian, who does all of our artwork, and instead of interview him from behind a microphone, start, a video episode at the site of the Berlin Wall, or the former, how different would that be than just listening to sound? Because now you're getting, sort of like you said, you're hitting every one of the 5 senses. Yeah. And I think that, not taste and touch, but still, the thing is that there's a bandwidth that happens, via video, audio, whatever it is, that, like you said, you can't get access to via a written text.
Right.
So I think that if you think about it, I describe it as levels of digital intimacy, right? With, writing being the lowest form of digital, I think, sort of audio being sort of the next, and video. And then of course, in person, which none of us can do right now, being the highest. Form of intimacy.
Right.
What's interesting, particularly about the time that we're in now, is this is, an observation I've made probably too many times over the last couple of weeks. People are probably sick of hearing me say it, but, you and I are probably relatively close in age. And when we were growing up, if you remember the late 80s, early 90s, the idea of seeing somebody's face on the other end of our cell phone, or not even a cell phone, the fact that you could see somebody's face on the phone, that was Back to the Future shit. You're like, man, that was
the Jetsons, man, right?
That was going to be amazing when it happened. And the funny thing is, it happened 10 years ago. And we basically, almost it's like we regressed in terms of our ability to communicate, because we went from, having that technology to going from, voice to text. There's a great line in the TV show One Tree Hill where one of the characters says, he's like, can you imagine if voice had been invented after text? People are like, holy shit, you can hear the person on the other end of the phone. So it's a really bizarre sort of thing. But I think that is one of the good things that's coming out of this, is that it's teaching us how to communicate with technology in a way that is far more human, and allowing us to access sort of this bandwidth that we don't get when we're just sending, the conversation you and I are having. Imagine having this via email.
This would stink via email.
Yeah. And nobody would, it would be ridiculous. So this is why I get really annoyed when people say, oh, can you send me the questions in advance? Or, or it's kind of like, well, no. I remember somebody once asked me, can you send us the questions you want to be asked for an interview? And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. You're the interviewer. That's your job. Or when I have, a publicist like, hey, can you send me questions in advance? I was like, no, I don't do that. I'm sorry to inform you, but if that's what you're looking for, we're the wrong fit. Or I'll send them and say, just so you know, I'm not going to ask any of these questions, but if it'll make you feel better, here's a way to I always say, go listen to an episode, because otherwise you're going to waste both of our times. I mean, I'm the person who is notorious. I will cut interviews in the middle of them if I don't like how it's
Well,
going.
and I think that's kind of the point is there's not hard rules, but there's different standards, different sort of whatever in each medium, but you have a lot of leeway because, I mean, who wants to listen? Because I get the same thing. I've people's publicists call me, oh, can you give me a list of I'm like, if I can give you the list of the questions, that would be far easier for me and them. And it would just be a transcript. We would call, maybe I'll sue you and we'll take a deposition. That's when we do transcripts. But like, if you want to have a great conversation, I have no idea what I'm going to ask that person until literally I hit the red button on the mic. And it's not because some people think that's sloppy, lazy. No, it's like, I've done my homework. I know sort of the notes I might want to hit, but I also know like, wow, if there's a left jab that comes out of nowhere and gets me a little dizzy, like, well, shit, I'll just go with it. Like,
Well, that's the thing, right? Those are the moments. So, NPR has this terminology called driveway moments.
Yeah.
And driveway moments don't come out of, sort of scripted. Now, keep in mind, like, we do have certain questions that we get to get the ball rolling that I'll use. And those are all asked by design, because I know, so for example, I had, Lydia Densworth here. Yeah. I think Densworth, who just wrote this beautiful book on friendship. And I knew, I was like, okay, of all the people who I could ask that question about what social group were you part of in high school, I was like, you wrote a book on friendship. You of all people will have a fascinating story behind this. And so part of the design of that is that human beings are wired for story. And when somebody is telling a story, it's very hard for us to stop listening. And particularly if it's like, wait, and so we, my old business partner, to his credit, figured this out about 3-4 years ago. He said, it's taking you 20 minutes to get into this like beautiful flow. He said, I think you can get there faster. Change the way you start the show. Don't ask anything about their work, and just go for one of these bizarre questions. And it's really hilarious to listen to people's reaction, because they're like, nobody's ever asked me that before. I'm like, yeah, I know.
That's good.
Because that means, well, the moment that they realize that's it. Their script is completely broken. No more,
But that's like watching an actor, promote a movie, and whether you see them on ABC, CBS, NBC, they're doing the same shtick, and it's like, it's a promotion. That's not what we want. Well, I'd love to be talented enough to sustain the length of your podcast, which is like an hour and 20, but mine is about 20 minutes and we're there.
Okay. Well, hopefully I didn't talk too much, but
it's fantastic, man.
Let me give you the do's and don'ts. I think that ultimately do this for the right motivation. Make sure that you're entertaining your audience, mastery over metrics, but mastery over metrics that's true whether you're an author, whether you're a speaker, whether you're a podcaster. Totally. And I think we've lost sight of that. And I think largely that's due to the fact that all of our metrics are publicly on display. So it's just this huge, competition.
Well, and it's a representation of our ego and all this other stuff. But I think I love the mastery over metrics, because, by the way, the mastery always has to happen first, and then the metrics. And even the metrics, I would say, listen, I'm a metrics guy, but it's easy to fall into this social media BS metric of retweets and all that. Unless that they're predictive indicators to an outcome that you're desiring, a lot of them are fluff. I couldn't tell you how many followers I have on Twitter. I mean, I haven't used social media for, I think, most of the quarantine. Like, I think I quit Facebook at the beginning of February. So let's see. A while ago. A couple of months.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll be at 90 days without Facebook. So I actually should write
you can write a book, 90 Days Without Facebook, and I lived. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Well, this has been awesome, Srini. I so much appreciate all your work and taking some time out of your day to spend it with us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, man. To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.